mean I'll see it.
It's one of those things you don't really talk about at a bar or over dinner because people look at you like you've finally lost your grip on reality. I'm telling you this because I've known you since we were kids, and I need someone to know the sequence of events before I can't explain them anymore. It didn't start with a scream or some cinematic jump scare. It started like a faint radio signal, the kind you hear coming from a neighbor's house when the windows are open and the wind is just right. I thought it was a neighbor. I thought maybe I was just tired from the overtime shifts. By the end of that first week, the sound had shifted. It wasn't a distant murmur anymore. It was a voice, perfectly clear, existing right behind my left ear. It didn't have a name, and it didn't have a face, but it had an obsession. It started narrating my life in the third person, like some sick documentary filmmaker who was bored of his subject. I'd reach for a glass of water in the middle of the night, and the voice would flatly state, "He is thirsty." I'd look at a kitchen knife while cutting an apple, and it would chime in with, "He is thinking about the edge." The tone was the worst part. It wasn't angry or demonic. It was clinical. It was a cold, detached observation of every mundane move I made. I tried to drown it out with music, with white noise machines, with earplugs that pushed so deep they made my ears ache, but the voice wasn't coming from the air. It was vibrating through my own skull. It felt like my brain was being shadowed by a parasite that knew my intentions before my muscles even twitched to execute them. I finally broke down and made an appointment with a psychiatrist. I figured I was experiencing some kind of late-onset schizophrenia or a neurological glitch. I sat in that sterile office, the smell of industrial lemon cleaner making my stomach churn, and looked at the doctor. He was an older guy, kind eyes, holding a clipboard and waiting for me to speak. But as I opened my mouth to tell him about the voice changed its script. It didn't narrate my movements this time. It spoke directly to me, and the shift in its delivery made the hair on my arms stand straight up. "Don't tell him about me," it whispered, the sound like dry autumn leaves scraping against pavement. "If you tell him about me, I'll tell him about what you did in the garage." The words hit me like a physical blow. I froze. The doctor leaned forward, asking if I was all right, but I couldn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to find a memory that didn't exist. I've never done anything in the garage. I use it for storage, some old holiday decorations, a lawnmower, a couple of half-empty paint cans from the previous owners. There's nothing there. But the voice sounded so certain, so smugly confident, that I felt a surge of genuine terror. I told the doctor I just had a migraine, paid the copay, and practically ran to my car. I didn't go back to work. I drove straight home, my grip on the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white and bloodless. The voice was silent the whole way. That silence was more oppressive than the narration had ever been. It felt like the air in the car was thickening, pressing against my lungs, making every breath a chore. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a long time, staring at the closed garage door. It's just an old, detached garage with siding that needs a power wash. Nothing more. I let myself in through the side door. The air inside was stale and held that metallic, biting scent of old iron and damp concrete. It wasn't the smell of copper, it was the smell of a butcher shop that hadn't been cleaned properly, a raw, organic tang that stuck to the back of my throat. I grabbed a crowbar from my workbench. I didn't even know what I was looking for, but I started pacing the floor, tapping the wood and the concrete sections. In the far back corner, behind a stack of rusted garden chairs, I saw it. One of the floorboards looked slightly elevated, the nails not quite flush with the wood. It was subtle. If I hadn't been looking for it, I never would have noticed. I jammed the crowbar into the gap and pried. The wood groaned and splintered, the sound echoing through the small space like a gunshot. Underneath that board, the earth wasn't packed hard like the rest of the foundation. It was loose. It was fresh. I started digging with my bare hands, the dirt shoving its way under my fingernails until they bled. The voice started up again then, but it wasn't cold anymore. It sounded excited. He is uncovering the truth, it said. He is seeing his future. I hit something soft about 2 feet down. At first, I thought it was a discarded rug or a bundle of rags. I kept digging, clearing the dirt away in frantic, messy handfuls. It wasn't a rug. It was a plastic tarp wrapped tight around something substantial. The smell that hit me then was overwhelming, not just the raw iron scent from before, but something sweet and cloying, the smell of meat that had been left in the sun for days until it turned gray and liquefied. I pulled back the edge of the plastic. My heart wasn't just beating, it was slamming against my ribs like a trapped animal. Inside the tarp was a body. It wasn't an old body. It hadn't been there for years. The skin was still somewhat supple, though it was beginning to take on that bruised, purplish-black hue of settling blood. There was so much of it. The bottom of the shallow grave was soaked, the dirt turned into a dark, viscous mud that looked like chocolate syrup but smelled like a slaughterhouse. The throat had been opened. It wasn't a clean cut. It looked like it had been done with something dull, or perhaps someone had just hacked away until they reached the bone. The edges of the wound were jagged and white where the fat peeked through the muscle. I stared at the face of the man in the grave, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. He looked like me. Not a twin, not a relative, he was me. He had the same mole on his neck, the same crooked front tooth I'd had since I fell off my bike at 10 years old. But he was older. Maybe 5 or 10 years older. His hands were calloused, and he was wearing a wedding ring I don't own. He is looking at the end of the story, the voice whispered. I backed away, tripping over the crowbar and falling hard onto the concrete. My hands were coated in that dark, sticky mud from the grave. I tried to wipe it off on my jeans, but I only succeeded in smearing it deeper into the fabric. The narration didn't stop. It began to describe my panic in horrifying detail. He feels the bile rising in his throat. He wonders if he is the killer or the victim. He realizes the timeline is bleeding. I ran back into the house and locked the door, but the voice was already inside. I went to the bathroom and scrubbed my hands until the skin was raw and weeping, but the dark stains under my nails wouldn't come out. I could still smell that raw, meaty stench on my skin, no matter how much soap I used. It's been 3 days. I haven't slept. Every time I close my eyes, I see the jagged edges of that neck wound. I see the version of myself staring up from the dirt with milky, sightless eyes. The voice is getting louder now. It's not just one voice anymore. There are others, a choir of narrators, all describing different versions of what I'm going to do next. One voice says I'm going to go back out there and finish the job, even though there's no one left to kill but myself. Another voice says I'm going to wait until the police arrive and try to explain that I found my own corpse in the garage. But the loudest one, the one that sounds exactly like me, just keeps repeating one phrase over and over. He is picking up the knife. He is looking at the edge. He is wondering how much it will hurt to match the man in the dirt. I'm looking at the kitchen drawer now. My hand is moving toward the handle. I don't want to do it, but my muscles are twitching, responding to the narration as if it's a set of instructions I can't disobey. It's a memory that hasn't happened yet, but I can feel the sting of the steel against my skin already. I can feel the warmth of the blood beginning to spill. Would you believe me if I told you I'm not the one moving my arm? Or would you just hear the story later and think I was just another guy who snapped? Either way, the story has to end. The narrator is very clear about that. I'm going to the garage now. I have to see if the grave is still empty or if I'm finally ready to fill it.
Next story.
The doctors called it a mild concussion, just a standard bump on the head after I tripped over a loose rug and caught the edge of the kitchen counter. There was a bit of blood, a dull ache behind my eyes, and a few hours of fog, but they sent me home with some painkillers and told me to rest. That was when the noise started. It wasn't a ringing or a buzz. It was a woman's voice. It wasn't coming from the hallway or through the walls of my apartment. It was sitting right in the center of my skull, vibrating against my jawbone. She wasn't whispering. She was shouting. The words were jagged and guttural, full of hard consonants that felt like they were scraping the inside of my ears. I don't speak anything other than English. I've never even been out of the country. But the way she spoke had this terrifying urgency to it, a frantic, rhythmic pace that made my heart hammer against my ribs every time she opened her mouth. It sounded like someone trying to warn you about a fire while they were being swallowed by the smoke. I tried to ignore it for the first few days, thinking it was just some neurological glitch from the fall. But it didn't stop. It got louder. It got more desperate. I'd be sitting at the table trying to eat, and this voice would erupt, screaming these strange, rhythmic phrases until I'd have to drop my fork and press my palms against my temples just to keep from being sick. Eventually, I got desperate. I took my phone, sat in the absolute silence of my bedroom, and recorded myself mimicking the sounds she was making. I felt like a lunatic, repeating these harsh, ancient-sounding syllables into the microphone, but I needed to know what was happening to my brain. I ended up taking the recording to a linguistics professor at the university nearby. I lied and told him I'd heard it in a weird dream. He was a small academic guy, the kind of person who usually looks bored by everything, but when I played the clip, the color drained out of his face so fast I thought he was going to faint. He made me play it 3 more times, leaning in close to the speaker. He told me it wasn't a dream. He said I was speaking an obscure, nearly extinct dialect of Aramaic, a language that hadn't been spoken as a primary tongue in centuries. When he translated the phrases for me, his voice was barely a whisper. The woman was saying, "The door is cumbersome and massive, but the latch is breaking. Tell them to stop digging." I walked home in a daze. It didn't make any sense until I rounded the corner to my street and saw the yellow excavators. My neighbors, a nice enough couple who had moved in a few months prior, had finally started work on the in-ground pool they'd been talking about. They had a whole crew back there, tearing into the earth, the hydraulic hiss of the machinery cutting through the afternoon air. I stood on my porch and watched the metal teeth of the digger bite into the dirt, and the voice in my head went absolutely ballistic. She wasn't just shouting anymore. She was pleading. 2 days later, the digging stopped. I was in my living room when the sound of the machinery suddenly cut out, replaced by the muffled shouting of the workers. I looked out the window and saw them all huddled around the edge of the pit. They had hit something. It wasn't a pipe or a rock. It was a massive, flat slab of gray stone etched with deep, swirling grooves that looked like they'd been burnt into the surface. That was the exact moment the voice changed. The shouting stopped instantly. For 3 seconds, there was a silence so profound it felt like the world had run out of air. Then, the screaming started. It wasn't the sound of someone in pain. It was the sound of something that had been waiting in the dark for 1,000 years and had finally seen a crack of light. It was a high-pitched, lung-tearing shriek that felt like a jagged piece of glass being dragged across my brain. I fell to my knees, clawing at my ears, but there was no way to block it out. It was coming from inside the meat of my own head. I crawled to the window and looked out. The workers were using crowbars, trying to wedge the slab up so they could see what was underneath. I wanted to run out there. I wanted to scream at them to stop, to cover it back up, to bury it under 10 feet of concrete. But the scream in my head was so intense I couldn't even form a thought. My vision started to go dark at the edges, my pulse throbbing with the force of a hammer against a lead pipe. They shifted the stone. Just a few inches. A smell began to waft over the fence. It wasn't the smell of decay, not exactly. It was worse. It was the thick, cloying scent of raw, open flesh and ancient, stagnant salt. It was the smell of a butcher shop that had been left to bake in the sun for a month, mixed with something sharp and chemical. It was so thick I could almost taste it on the back of my tongue, a metallic, iron-like bitterness that made my throat constrict. I watched through the glass as the foreman leaned over the hole. He stopped, his body going completely rigid. Then he dropped his crowbar and began to vomit, the sound of it wet and violent. The other men backed away, their faces twisted in pure, unadulterated horror. One of them fell backward, scrambling away on his hands and feet like a terrified animal. From my vantage point, I could see down into the dark slit they'd opened. Something was moving in the shadows beneath the stone. It wasn't a person. It was a mass of pale, translucent tissue, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic hunger. It looked like a sea of raw nerves, twitching and reaching upward. And then I saw the hair. Long, matted clumps of black hair, tangled with bits of bone and what looked like human teeth, rising out of the opening like it was being pushed from below. The scream in my head reached a pitch I didn't think was humanly possible. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a physical force. I felt a warm trickle of fluid run out of my nose and down my lip. I wiped it away and saw a dark, viscous red on my fingers. My ears started to bleed to a slow, steady drip that stained the collar of my shirt. The woman's voice finally found words again, but they weren't Aramaic. They were just a single, repeated command in a voice that sounded like tearing wet silk. Feed. 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 I saw the foreman, the man who had been vomiting, suddenly stop. He straightened his back. His movements were jerky, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. He turned and looked directly at my window. His eyes weren't eyes anymore. They were just two leaking holes of dark, thick fluid. He smiled, and I saw that his teeth had been shattered, jagged shards of white sticking out of bleeding gums. He walked back to the hole and stepped in. He didn't jump. He just walked into the dark as if he were stepping into a bathtub. The sound that came out of that pit was the most sickening thing I've ever heard. It was the sound of 1,000 wet sponges being torn apart at once. The sound of bones snapping like dry kindling. The other workers didn't run. They couldn't. They stood there, shivering, their eyes rolling back in their heads as they began to hum in unison, a low, droning sound that matched the vibration in my skull. One by one, they walked to the edge. I haven't left my house in 3 days. I've pushed every piece of furniture I own against the doors and windows. The police came by once, but they didn't knock. I watched them through the peephole. They just stood on the porch for 20 minutes, staring at the wood of the door, their heads tilted at the same unnatural angle. Then they walked to the backyard and disappeared into the pit. The voice hasn't stopped. It's a constant, wet whispering now. She tells me how hungry she is. She tells me how thin the walls are. She tells me that the skin is just a different kind of door and that hers is already open. I'm sitting in my bathroom now because it's the only room without a window. I have a kitchen knife in my hand. Not to defend myself, I know that's useless. I'm looking at the reflection in the mirror, watching the way my own skin seems to be twitching, as if something is trying to stitch itself together underneath my cheeks. The smell is inside the house now. It's coming up through the drains. It's thick, suffocating, and smells like a fresh kill. The screaming has started again, but it's not just in my head anymore. I can hear it coming from the backyard. And I can hear the sound of wet, heavy footsteps walking up my driveway. The latch didn't just break. It's gone. And I think she's tired of waiting for me to come outside.
Next story.
The thing about that voice is that it didn't sound like a ghost or a demon from some movie. It sounded like a recording of myself, but layered, like 3 different versions of my own voice speaking at the exact same millisecond. It was clean. It was clinical. And it didn't feel like it was coming through my ears. It felt like it was being projected from the very base of my brainstem, vibrating upward through my teeth. I was driving home late after a double shift. The highway was that specific kind of empty where the world feels like it's just you and the narrow cone of your headlights. I was drifting, honestly, probably half asleep behind the wheel when the command hit me. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a physical jolt. Brake. No. I didn't even think. My leg acted on its own, slamming the pedal into the floorboards. The tires screamed, and my car fishtailed slightly as the ABS kicked in, dragging me to a dead stop just feet before the intersection. A heartbeat later, a semi-truck, no lights, no horn, just a blurred wall of rusted metal, roared through the red light at 70 miles per hour. It was so close that the wind from its passage rocked my car, nearly pulling my front bumper along with it. If I had stayed at my cruising speed, I wouldn't have just been hit. I would have been erased. I sat there in the dark, my chest tight and my lungs refusing to take in air, waiting for the shakes to start. I should have been crying or calling someone. Instead, I just stared at the empty road, listening to the silence. And then the voice spoke again, much quieter this time. Proceed. I did what it said. I drove home in a trance. For the first few days, I tried to convince myself it was just a massive spike of adrenaline or some kind of dormant survival instinct that had finally woken up. I told myself I was lucky. But the voice didn't leave after saving my life. It stayed, and it started getting specific. It began with small things that felt almost helpful, or at least harmless. I'd be at the grocery store, reaching for a carton of milk, and the vibration would rattle my skull. Not that one. I'd pull my hand back and grab the one behind it, only to realize the first one had a broken seal or was leaking. Then it started dictating my movements. Turn left here. I'd be on my way to work, a route I've taken for 5 years, and it would force me onto a side street. Later, I'd hear on the radio that there had been a multi-car pileup on the main road. It felt like I had a guardian angel, but one made of cold, sharp glass. There was no warmth in it. No love. Just directives. By the second week, the autonomy of my own body started to feel like it was slipping away. It wasn't just that I was listening to the voice, it was that my muscles were beginning to anticipate the commands. I'd find myself turning the steering wheel before the voice even finished the word. The wee part of my brain was starting to take over the I part. The horror of the situation didn't truly settle in until the night I was making dinner. I was chopping onions, the knife moving in a steady, rhythmic thud against the wood. The voice suddenly boomed, louder than it had been since the night of the truck. Drop it. I let go of the knife instantly. It clattered onto the counter, the blade narrowly missing my hand. I stood there, staring at the steel, and for the first time, I tried to talk back. I asked out loud, why? The silence that followed was suffocating. It was a dense, stifling pressure that seemed to fill the kitchen, making it hard to move my limbs. Then the response came, but it wasn't a command. It was a statement of fact. You are going to slip. We cannot have the vessel damaged yet. My stomach turned. The word vessel stayed in my head like a rot. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed, watching the shadows in the corner of the room, feeling the presence of something that wasn't me, sitting inside of me. It felt like there was a parasite woven into my nervous system, threading its way through my nerves like ivy on a trellis. The physical sensations started getting worse after that. I began to notice a smell. It wasn't something from the outside world. It was coming from inside my own nose. It was the scent of something metallic and raw, like a fresh wound or the air in an old basement where the pipes have been leaking for years. It was the smell of something biological that had gone wrong, a cloying, iron-rich stench that made my throat constrict every time I swallowed. I stopped seeing my friends. I stopped answering the phone. I was terrified that if I spoke, the voice would come out instead of mine. I spent hours in front of the bathroom mirror, just watching my eyes. I looked the same, but there was a dullness there, a lack of spark that hadn't been there before. Last night was the breaking point. I had been sitting in the dark for hours, the house silent except for the humming of the refrigerator. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my jaw, a localized, grinding pressure like my teeth were being pushed deeper into my gums. My hand moved without me. It reached up and began to stroke my own cheek, but the movement was wrong. It was too slow, too predatory. It wasn't the way a person touches themselves. It was the way a person touches a piece of fabric they are thinking about buying. I forced myself up and stumbled to the bathroom, fumbling for the light switch. I grabbed the edges of the porcelain sink so hard my knuckles turned white. I looked at my reflection, my breath coming in jagged, shallow hitches. I stared into my own pupils and tried to scream. I tried to say, "Get out of me," or "I'm in control," or anything that would prove I was still the one behind the wheel. I watched my own mouth move in the mirror. My lips parted, but the muscles didn't move the way they usually do when I talk. They pulled back into a wide, unnatural grin that showed too much of my gums, stretching the skin until it looked like it might tear at the corners. The voice didn't vibrate in my head this time. It came out of my actual throat. It was a wet, raspy sound, layered with that same triple-toned resonance. "We are almost finished with this one," my mouth said. I tried to pull my hands away from the sink, but they wouldn't move. I was a passenger in my own skin, locked in a meat suit that was being piloted by something else. I watched as my reflection reached out a finger and traced the glass of the mirror, leaving a smear of something dark and viscous that had begun to leak from under my fingernails. It wasn't just blood, it was thicker, darker, like old oil mixed with shredded tissue. The smell of the raw, iron-rich rot filled the small room, becoming so intense I thought I would vomit, but my stomach muscles wouldn't contract. I just stood there, smiling at myself, while my eyes began to fill with that same dark, leaking fluid. The worst part isn't the fear anymore. It's the realization that the voice was never an angel. It didn't save my life because it cared about me. It saved the car because it wanted to drive it. I can feel it now, stretching out inside my chest, unfolding its limbs into mine. My memories are starting to feel like things I read in a book once, distant and unimportant. I remember the name of my mother, but I don't remember the feeling of her hug. I remember the layout of my house, but it feels like a floor plan, not a home. I'm writing this now because I have a few minutes of lucidity while the presence is occupied. I can feel it deep in my gut, working on something, stitching itself into my organs. My fingers are typing, but I can feel the hesitation in the joints, the way the thing inside is learning the rhythm of the keys. I looked in the mirror one last time before coming to the computer. My skin looks translucent now, almost gray, and I can see something moving just beneath the surface of my throat. It looks like a pulse, but it's out of sync with my heart. I don't think I'll be able to stop it when it decides to leave this room. I don't know what it wants or where it's going, but I know that when I walk out that door, I won't be the one walking. If you see me, if you see anyone who looks like they're moving just a little too precisely, or whose smile doesn't quite reach their leaking eyes, don't call out. Don't try to help. Just run. Because we are almost finished with this one, and we're going to need a new one soon.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.